Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most haunting possibilities in the long arc of human ambition. The idea of a generation ship, a vessel large enough and self-contained enough to carry human beings across the gulf between stars over centuries, with children born into the journey, growing old aboard it, and dying without ever seeing the destination their grandparents departed for. Proxima Centauri, our nearest stellar neighbor, sits 4.2 light-years away, roughly 25 trillion miles from the world we know. At the speed of our fastest spacecraft today, the crossing would take about 80,000 years. Even at 1/10 the speed of light, a velocity we have no idea how to reach, the journey would last more than 4 decades. For more distant systems, the numbers swell into 500, 1,000, even 2,000-year voyages. Long enough that the hardest problems stop being engineering, they become human. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why generation ships may be humanity's only realistic path to the stars, why the engineering challenges of propulsion, habitat, and self-sufficiency are not the terrifying part, and why the deepest problems are cohesion, consent, and meaning across generations of people born into a mission they never chose. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. These are not abstract numbers, they are the shape of the problem. And to understand why humanity would even consider building a world inside a spacecraft, you have to sit with that reality for a moment. Proxima Centauri is 4.2 light-years away. Light itself, traveling at 186,000 miles per second, takes 4 years and 2 months to complete the crossing. Our fastest spacecraft, the kind we have built and launched, and can point with pride at as genuine achievements of engineering, leave the solar system at roughly 36,000 miles per hour. That sounds fast. It is fast by every human standard. But space does not operate on human standards. At 36,000 miles per hour, reaching Proxima Centauri would take about 80,000 years. Think about what that number means. Every civilization that ever wrote anything down, every empire that ever rose and collapsed, every language, religion, dynasty, and war in the entire span of recorded human history, all of that fits inside roughly 6,000 years. The journey to our nearest neighbor, at our current best speed, would take more than 13 times that. You would need to start before Homo sapiens developed agriculture and arrive long after whatever comes next. Conventional propulsion is not a slow option. It is not an option at all. So scientists and engineers have imagined faster ways. Nuclear pulse propulsion would detonate nuclear bombs behind the ship in rapid sequence and ride each shockwave forward. Fusion rockets would use the same process that powers stars, fusing hydrogen nuclei together and channeling the released energy into thrust. Antimatter engines would annihilate matter and antimatter in controlled bursts, theoretically reaching significant fractions of light speed. Light sails would unfurl enormous reflective sheets and let powerful ground-based lasers push the ship to speed over vast distances, like a sailboat riding a wind that never stops. Some of these proposals suggest reaching 10% of the speed of light. At that speed, the crossing to Proxima Centauri shrinks to about 42 years, a human lifetime. A single generation, perhaps, with enough life at the end to report back what they found. But here's where it gets strange. 10% of light speed sounds manageable. It sounds almost reasonable. Until you think about what it actually means to move that fast through space, that is not, in fact, empty. At 10% of light speed, a grain of sand becomes a weapon. The collision releases energy equivalent to several sticks of dynamite. Not a small impact, not a dent you could repair. Detonation-scale energy, delivered in an instant from a particle too small to see with the naked eye. A pebble would not damage the ship. A pebble would end it, and space, thin as it is, contains grains of sand. It contains dust. It contains microscopic particles drifting through the interstellar medium, distributed unevenly across the void. At ordinary speeds, these particles pass through or around a spacecraft harmlessly. At 10% of light speed, the interstellar medium becomes a sandblaster running at full power, continuously, for decades. The hull does not stay intact, it erodes. And the shielding required to survive that erosion would need to be several feet thick, dense enough to absorb those impacts without catastrophic failure. That shielding adds enormous mass. And mass is the enemy of speed. The energy requirement alone collapses the concept. Accelerating just 1 kilogram of material to 10% of light speed requires roughly 450 trillion joules. To put that in perspective, a large nuclear power plant running continuously for a full year produces around 30 billion joules of usable electricity. Reaching 10% of light speed for a single kilogram would demand that plant run for roughly 15,000 years. Now consider that a generation ship capable of carrying a viable population, thousands of people plus food systems and water systems and machinery and everything needed to sustain a civilization for centuries, would mass millions of kilograms. The energy required would exceed everything humanity has ever generated across all of history by a staggering margin. We have no way to produce it. We have no way to store it. We have no way to release it in a controlled enough fashion to matter. Not a technical hurdle we haven't cleared yet. A different order of problem entirely. So we fall back. The realistic ceiling, the speed that might be achievable with propulsion systems we can at least imagine building in the next few centuries, is somewhere around 1% of light speed. Optimistic projections reach 2%. At 1% of light speed, a ship would be traveling at roughly 6.7 million miles per hour. That is genuinely extraordinary. It is about 186 times faster than our current best. And it is still not enough to make this a single generation undertaking. At 1% of light speed, the crossing to Proxima Centauri takes over 400 years. 400 years ago, the telescope had just been invented. Shakespeare was still writing. The American continents were known to Europeans for barely a century. The ship that left Earth then would not arrive until well into what we now call the future. And Proxima Centauri may not even be the destination. It orbits in a triple star system with complex gravitational dynamics. The star systems with planets we might actually want to reach, systems where conditions approach something tolerable, are farther away. Journey times of 500 years, 1,000 years. 2,000 years are not far-fetched once you account for the targets worth going to. No human lives that long. No single generation spans even a fraction of that span. The people who board a generation ship will not see the destination. Their children will not see it. Their grandchildren may not see it. Depending on the target, neither will their great-grandchildren. This is the moment where the engineering problem transforms into something harder. The ship cannot simply be a vehicle with enough fuel and food. It has to be a world. A place where people are born, grow up, fall in love, raise children, grow old, and die. All while moving through the dark at a speed no human has ever experienced, toward a destination none of them will live to reach. That realization is where the real questions begin. So what does a world actually contain? Start with people. A ship carrying a handful of specialists cannot survive a 1,000-year crossing. Not because of morale, though that matters. Not because of boredom, though that matters too. Because of genetics. A small population carries limited genetic diversity, and over generations that limitation compounds. Inbreeding concentrates harmful traits. Random deaths remove irreplaceable skills. A community of 50 or 100 people, closed off from the rest of humanity for a millennium, would arrive genetically damaged, if it arrived at all. Most studies that take this problem seriously suggest a minimum population of around 500 to 1,000 people. Some researchers push the number much higher, into the several thousands. Once you account for the randomness of who dies when and what skills disappear with them, this is not a ship carrying a crew, this is a ship carrying a town, and a town needs everything a town needs. Living quarters, schools, hospitals, gardens, workshops, water treatment, waste processing. Places where people argue, and places where people grieve, and places where children learn to walk. All of it sealed inside a structure moving through a vacuum, with no neighboring town, no supply chain, no emergency services within centuries of reach. When you begin to actually list what that requires, the scale of the engineering becomes something else entirely. The ship itself has to be massive. Two design concepts come up most often in serious discussions. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most haunting possibilities in the long arc of human ambition. The idea of a generation ship, a vessel large enough and self-contained enough to carry human beings across the gulf between stars over centuries, with children born into the journey, growing old aboard it. and dying without ever seeing the destination their grandparents departed for. Proxima Centauri, our nearest stellar neighbor, sits 4.2 light-years away, roughly 25 trillion miles from the world we know. At the speed of our fastest spacecraft today, the crossing would take about 80,000 years. Even at 1/10 the speed of light, a velocity we have no idea how to reach, the journey would last more than 4 decades. For more distant systems, the numbers swell into 500, 1,000, even 2,000-year voyages. Long enough that the hardest problems stop being engineering, they become human. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why generation ships may be humanity's only realistic path to the stars, why the engineering challenges of propulsion, habitat, and self-sufficiency are not the terrifying part, and why the deepest problems are cohesion, consent, and meaning across generations of people born into a mission they never chose. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. These are not abstract numbers, they are the shape of the problem. And to understand why humanity would even consider building a world inside a spacecraft, you have to sit with that reality for a moment. Proxima Centauri is 4.2 light-years away. Light itself, traveling at 186,000 miles per second, takes 4 years and 2 months to complete the crossing. Our fastest spacecraft, the kind we have built and launched, and can point with pride at as genuine achievements of engineering, leave the solar system at roughly 36,000 miles per hour. That sounds fast. It is fast by every human standard. But space does not operate on human standards. At 36,000 miles per hour, reaching Proxima Centauri would take about 80,000 years. Think about what that number means. Every civilization that ever wrote anything down, every empire that ever rose and collapsed, every language, religion, dynasty, and war in the entire span of recorded human history, all of that fits inside roughly 6,000 years. The journey to our nearest neighbor, at our current best speed, would take more than 13 times that. You would need to start before Homo sapiens developed agriculture and arrive long after whatever comes next. Conventional propulsion is not a slow option. It is not an option at all. So scientists and engineers have imagined faster ways. Nuclear pulse propulsion would detonate nuclear bombs behind the ship in rapid sequence and ride each shockwave forward. Fusion rockets would use the same process that powers stars, fusing hydrogen nuclei together and channeling the released energy into thrust. Antimatter engines would annihilate matter and antimatter in controlled bursts, theoretically reaching significant fractions of light speed. Light sails would unfurl enormous reflective sheets and let powerful ground-based lasers push the ship to speed over vast distances, like a sailboat riding a wind that never stops. Some of these proposals suggest reaching 10% of the speed of light. At that speed, the crossing to Proxima Centauri shrinks to about 42 years, a human lifetime. A single generation, perhaps, with enough life at the end to report back what they found. But here's where it gets strange. 10% of light speed sounds manageable. It sounds almost reasonable, until you think about what it actually means to move that fast through space that is not, in fact, empty. At 10% of light speed, a grain of sand becomes a weapon. The collision releases energy equivalent to several sticks of dynamite. Not a small impact, not a dent you could repair. Detonation-scale energy, delivered in an instant from a particle too small to see with the naked eye. A pebble would not damage the ship. A pebble would end it, and space, thin as it is, contains grains of sand. It contains dust. It contains microscopic particles drifting through the interstellar medium, distributed unevenly across the void. At ordinary speeds, these particles pass through or around a spacecraft harmlessly. At 10% of light speed, the interstellar medium becomes a sandblaster running at full power, continuously, for decades. The hull does not stay intact, it erodes. And the shielding required to survive that erosion would need to be several feet thick, dense enough to absorb those impacts without catastrophic failure. That shielding adds enormous mass, and mass is the enemy of speed. The energy requirement alone collapses the concept. Accelerating just 1 kilogram of material to 10% of light speed requires roughly 450 trillion joules. To put that in perspective, A large nuclear power plant running continuously for a full year produces around 30 billion joules of usable electricity. Reaching 10% of light speed for a single kilogram would demand that plant run for roughly 15,000 years. Now consider that a generation ship capable of carrying a viable population, thousands of people plus food systems and water systems and machinery and everything needed to sustain a civilization for centuries, would mass millions of kilograms. The energy required would exceed everything humanity has ever generated across all of history by a staggering margin. We have no way to produce it. We have no way to store it. We have no way to release it in a controlled enough fashion to matter. Not a technical hurdle we haven't cleared yet. A different order of problem entirely. So we fall back. The realistic ceiling, the speed that might be achievable with propulsion systems we can at least imagine building in the next few centuries, is somewhere around 1% of light speed. Optimistic projections reach 2%. At 1% of light speed, a ship would be traveling at roughly 6.7 million miles per hour. That is genuinely extraordinary. It is about 186 times faster than our current best. And it is still not enough to make this a single generation undertaking. At 1% of light speed, the crossing to Proxima Centauri takes over 400 years. 400 years ago, the telescope had just been invented. Shakespeare was still writing. The American continents were known to Europeans for barely a century. The ship that left Earth then would not arrive until well into what we now call the future. And Proxima Centauri may not even be the destination. It orbits in a triple star system with complex gravitational dynamics. The star systems with planets we might actually want to reach, systems where conditions approach something tolerable, are farther away. Journey times of 500 years, 1,000 years. 2,000 years are not far-fetched once you account for the targets worth going to. No human lives that long. No single generation spans even a fraction of that span. The people who board a generation ship will not see the destination. Their children will not see it. Their grandchildren may not see it. Depending on the target, neither will their great-grandchildren. This is the moment where the engineering problem transforms into something harder. The ship cannot simply be a vehicle with enough fuel and food. It has to be a world. A place where people are born, grow up, fall in love, raise children, grow old, and die. All while moving through the dark at a speed no human has ever experienced, toward a destination none of them will live to reach. That realization is where the real questions begin. So what does a world actually contain? Start with people. A ship carrying a handful of specialists cannot survive 1,000-year crossing. Not because of morale, though that matters. Not because of boredom, though that matters too. Because of genetics. A small population carries limited genetic diversity, and over generations that limitation compounds. Inbreeding concentrates harmful traits. Random deaths remove irreplaceable skills. A community of 50 or 100 people, closed off from the rest of humanity for a millennium, would arrive genetically damaged, if it arrived at all. Most studies that take this problem seriously suggest a minimum population of around 500 to 1,000 people. Some researchers push the number much higher, into the several thousands. Once you account for the randomness of who dies when and what skills disappear with them, this is not a ship carrying a crew, this is a ship carrying a town, and a town needs everything a town needs. Living quarters, schools, hospitals, gardens, workshops, water treatment, waste processing. Places where people argue, and places where people grieve, and places where children learn to walk. All of it sealed inside a structure moving through a vacuum, with no neighboring town, no supply chain, no emergency services within centuries of reach. When you begin to actually list what that requires, the scale of the engineering becomes something else entirely. The ship itself has to be massive. Two design concepts come up most often in serious discussions. The first is the O'Neill cylinder, named after physicist Gerard O'Neill, who developed the concept in the 1970s. Picture a hollow tube, several miles long, half a mile across. The tube rotates along its long axis. People living on the inner surface of that tube feel pushed outward by the rotation, the same way you feel pressed into your seat on a spinning carnival ride. That outward pressure mimics gravity. Walk around the inside of the cylinder, and the curved floor curves up on either side of you, a landscape bending away overhead. The second design is the torus, a giant ring rotating around a central hub. Both concepts use rotation as a substitute for gravity, because without it, human bodies deteriorate, bones thin, muscles weaken, the cardiovascular system stops working properly. Gravity is not a luxury, it is medicine. Both structures require materials capable of handling enormous rotational stress. The forces pulling outward on a spinning cylinder several miles long and half a mile wide are substantial. The walls have to hold, for centuries, without failure, then there is power. A ship this size, running for this long, requires energy on a scale that has no precedent in human spaceflight history. Solar panels are not an option. The sun's light fades with distance according to a merciless mathematical law. By the time a generation ship reaches even the nearest stars, the sun is just another faint point in the dark. Nuclear fission reactors, the kind we actually know how to build, can run for decades before their fuel is spent. Decades is not centuries. Fusion reactors, which generate power by fusing hydrogen atoms together the way stars do, could in theory run far longer on far less fuel. But fusion power remains theoretical at this scale. We have been working on practical fusion energy for most of a century, and have not yet achieved it. A generation ship staking its survival on fusion, working precisely when needed, is staking a lot. But here's where it gets strange. The power problem is not even the hardest part of the energy equation. Everything on the ship must be recycled. Every drop of water, every molecule of oxygen, every gram of food. Nothing enters from outside. Nothing is ever replenished. The ship must run as a closed loop, where waste becomes input, where every resource cycles back through the system endlessly. Hydroponic systems grow food under artificial light. Carbon dioxide exhaled by the crew is captured and converted back to oxygen. Urine and wastewater are processed back into drinking water. Human waste is composted into soil. The systems that do this must work continuously, without failure, for the entire length of the crossing. And here is the brutal fact underneath all of that. Any one of those systems failing is catastrophic, not inconvenient. Not costly, catastrophic. A complete failure in water recycling and the crew begins dying within days. A failure in oxygen production, and the timeline compresses even further. A failure in temperature control, in food production, in the systems that scrub carbon dioxide from the air, each one is a potential extinction event for everyone on board. Every critical system is, in isolation, a single point of complete failure, which means every critical system must be backed up, and the backup must be backed up. And all of that redundancy adds mass. Mass is the enemy of every engineering decision on a generation ship. More redundancy means more mass. More mass means more fuel required to accelerate the ship. More fuel means more mass still. The two imperatives of this project, build it safe enough to last 1,000 years, and build it light enough to actually move, are in direct opposition. Make it safer, and you make it heavier. Make it lighter, and you make it more fragile. There is no clean solution to that tension. Every design is a negotiation between these two forces, and neither side ever fully wins. Radiation adds another layer. Open space is not empty. Cosmic rays, high-energy particles streaming from distant supernovae, and other violent events pass through the void continuously. On Earth, we are protected by a magnetic field and a thick atmosphere. A generation ship has neither. Without shielding, the crew absorbs radiation across their entire lives. DNA damage accumulates, cancer rates rise, neurological problems develop. Lifespans shorten over generations, producing a population arriving at the destination already compromised. Shielding requires thick absorbing materials, water, polyethylene, dense composites. One design idea worth noting: surround the living areas with the ship's water supply. The same tanks that hold drinking water for 1,000 people can absorb cosmic rays. The resource does two jobs at once. But those tanks add mass, and mass returns us to the same brutal trade-off as before. Micrometeorites add yet another layer. Over the span of centuries, the odds of small impacts accumulate. A tiny piece of rock or ice moving at high relative velocity can punch through a hull. The ship needs multi-layer shielding on its outer surface, materials designed to absorb or deflect impacts, compartmentalization, so that a breach in one section does not kill the entire vessel. And it needs the ability to repair itself. This is the piece most people do not anticipate. Metal fatigues, seals crack, electronics fail, bearings wear down, filters clog. Every component on that ship has a finite operational lifespan, and over 1,000 years, Every component will need to be replaced. Not once, multiple times. The crew cannot call for a part. There is no delivery. The ship must be able to manufacture what it needs. From raw materials carried in its hold, using machine shops and fabrication systems that are themselves subject to wear and failure. The crew must know how to run those systems, and when those systems fail, the crew must know how to fix them. The International Space Station has been continuously occupied for more than 20 years. In that entire time, it has never been self-sufficient, not for a single day. It requires regular resupply missions carrying food, water, spare parts, replacement components. It is kept alive by an unbroken chain of launches from Earth. A generation ship must do what the ISS has never done, not for 20 years, but for a minimum of 20 times that duration. 4 centuries. Perhaps longer. That is the engineering problem. And it is genuine, and it is enormous, and it has no fully solved solution anywhere in our current technology. But the engineering challenges pale next to what comes after them. Building the ship is hard. The harder questions are about the people inside it. Think about what it means to be born inside a machine. Not born near it. Not born with it visible through a window. Born inside it, with metal walls on every side, and recycled air in your lungs from your first breath, and artificial light, the only light you have ever known. No sunrise, no open sky, no rain. The ship is not where you live. The ship is everything that exists. A person born aboard a generation ship will know Earth the way you know a city you have never visited, through images. Through stored video, blue oceans, green forests, a sky that goes on until you cannot tell where it ends. They will be able to describe those things accurately. They will have seen them in high resolution, from multiple angles, with audio. And none of that will mean what it means to you, because they will never have felt wind, never stood under open sky, never looked at a horizon that bent away from them in the right direction. In a rotating cylindrical habitat, the horizon does not behave as it should. The ground curves upward. Walk in any direction and the world bends toward you, then over you, then behind you. The landscape does not extend outward and flatten. It curves up on both sides and closes above your head. Everything is enclosed. Everything curves back. There is no edge of vision where something begins that you have not yet seen. You can see it all from where you stand. You always could. This is the world a child born aboard will grow up inside. Not a small world in the emotional sense. It is literally small, bounded, finite in every direction. Now consider the lifespan that unfolds inside that world. 70 years, 80, maybe 90. That is how long a person born aboard might live. Most of those years spent in transit, with no origin behind them they ever knew directly, and no destination ahead they will ever reach. They are not the first generation, the ones who chose to leave. They did not choose. And they will not be the last generation, the ones who finally arrive. They will live and age and die in between. One link in a chain that spans centuries. The chain has a beginning, it has an end. And most of the people in it are neither. That is the lifespan and purpose problem, and it is not a small one. We do have some sense of what prolonged confinement does to people. Antarctic research stations run for months, at a time with crews isolated from the rest of the world. Submarines run for weeks or months beneath the surface, sealed off, with no way out until the mission ends. And the data from those environments is not reassuring. Depression rises, conflicts increase. Social bonds fray in ways that are difficult to predict and difficult to reverse. Small irritations become serious frictions. Hierarchy becomes contested. People who were stable and carefully selected before departure develop problems that no screening process fully anticipated. But here's where it gets strange. Every single person in those environments knows the confinement will end. The Antarctic researcher knows the season has a conclusion. The submarine crew knows the mission has a surface date. The knowledge that an exit exists changes the psychological equation in ways that are not trivial. Even when the isolation is severe, that knowledge is a load-bearing wall. You endure because you know you will eventually not have to. On a generation ship, there is no exit date. Not for most of the people aboard. Not ever. The confinement does not end when the mission ends. The confinement ends when they die. And then the next generation faces the same walls, the same recycled air, the same bounded horizon. And so does the generation after that. We do not know whether humans can tolerate this. Not tolerate it briefly, under controlled conditions with support systems in place. tolerate it as a permanent condition across a full human lifespan, and then transfer that tolerance to children who had no say in the matter? The honest answer is that we do not have evidence that this is possible. The honest answer is that everything we know from confined environments points in the wrong direction. If resentment builds, the consequences are not minor. A person who resents the mission, who feels that their life was conscripted into a project they did not choose, has options that threaten everyone aboard. Sabotage is one. Not dramatic sabotage, not necessarily deliberate. Neglect. A critical system not maintained quite as carefully as it should be. A repair delayed. A protocol followed loosely. Over decades, over generations, these small acts of disengagement compound. Refusal to reproduce is another. The generational chain only works if each generation replaces itself. If people decide, in large enough numbers, that they do not want to bring children into this enclosed world, the population declines, the expertise pool shrinks, and eventually the chain breaks. Not through violence. Through the accumulated decision of individuals who saw no reason to continue a mission they had not chosen, and factions form. On a voyage lasting centuries, with generations passing, and the original goal receding further into abstraction, people will develop competing visions of what the mission is for. Some will maintain the original purpose. Some will decide the ship itself is home now, and arrival is neither necessary nor desirable. Some will want to turn back, even if turning back is no longer a real option. These are not irrational positions. They are predictable positions, given enough time and enough confinement. The question is whether any social structure can hold them together. What you need, across hundreds of years of transit, is a governance system that works. Educational systems that transmit not just technical knowledge but purpose. Cultural practices that bind people to a shared project across generations. All of that invented before departure. All of it built to last longer than any human institution in history has ever lasted without external contact, without renewal from outside, without the friction and stimulation of the wider world keeping it alive. The engineering challenges of building a generation ship are enormous. No one disputes that. But the engineering is at least a domain we understand. We can model it, we can test components, we can iterate. The social and psychological question is harder, because the conditions cannot be fully replicated on Earth, and because the failure modes are not predictable in the same way a structural failure is predictable. The hardest part of a generation ship is not the ship, not the hull, not the reactor, not the life support. The hardest part is the people who must live inside it for centuries, and that problem is still waiting to be solved. How we might begin solving it is where we turn next. Who decides anything aboard a ship like this? That question seems almost administrative when you first encounter it. A captain, officers, a council of specialists. Reasonable people working through reasonable problems. But think about what happens to that structure 20 years in. 30 years in, the original captain dies, the original officers age out. The people who actually chose this mission, who trained for it, who understood its purpose in the bones-deep way you only understand something you fought to be part of, are gone. Their children inherit the command structure. Their grandchildren inherit it from them. And those descendants, born into a role they never applied for, running a mission they never voted on, governing a population that grows more distant from the original purpose with every generation, must somehow keep the whole thing functional. Not for a term, not for a career, indefinitely. That is not a management problem. It is a political problem of a kind that has no clean solution, because no human society has ever faced it in quite this form. We do have analogies. They are not reassuring. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using star charts, wave patterns, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. They settled some of the most remote islands on Earth. But after settlement, some of those communities lost the knowledge of long-distance navigation entirely. Not because they were careless, not because they stopped valuing it. Because on an island with no need to cross the open ocean anymore, the skill had no obvious daily application, and over generations it quietly disappeared. The knowledge existed, and then it didn't. And by the time anyone realized it was gone, the people who held it were gone too. Easter Island tells a different story and a darker one. A population on a finite island with finite resources made decisions that depleted both. The forest went first, then the soil, then the food chain. The society that built the great stone figures eventually collapsed under the weight of choices that seemed reasonable in the short term and catastrophic across generations. No single decision doomed Easter Island. The doom accumulated slowly, through the ordinary logic of a closed system with no outside correction. A generation ship is both of those things at once. It is an island where lost knowledge cannot be recovered, because there is no neighbouring island to ask. And it is a closed system where resource decisions compound over centuries, with no external correction available. One skill lost, one leadership transition gone badly, one resource miscalculation allowed to grow unchecked, and there is no rescue. No external pressure to force a correction. Whatever happens inside the ship stays inside the ship. But here's where it gets strange. The people designing the governance system before departure face a problem that has no historical template. On Earth, institutions persist beyond individual lifetimes because they exist inside a wider world that stabilizes them. A democratic constitution survives because courts, armies, competing powers, and international pressure all constrain the people who might otherwise simply ignore it. A monarchy persists because neighbouring kingdoms and internal factions push back against absolute dysfunction. Institutions are not self-sustaining objects. They are systems that stay alive because the world around them is alive. The ship has none of that. Whatever the first generation designs, whether it is a democratic council, a military-style command structure, or some hybrid, becomes the template for everyone who comes after. And the second generation, who did not design it, who grew up inside it rather than choosing it, may want something different. If the system allows peaceful reform, that tension can be resolved without crisis. If the system is rigid, the pressure builds. It builds silently. It builds across years and decades. And eventually it finds a way out. On Earth, dissatisfied people have options. They can protest. They can vote. They can move somewhere else entirely. On the ship, there is nowhere to go. Frustration has no exit. Anger has no relief valve. Dissent suppressed does not disappear. It festers. It deepens. It spreads to people who weren't originally angry, because when you share a closed space with people in pain, their pain becomes yours whether you want it to or not. And then at some point, it erupts. A rebellion that succeeds destroys the system it replaces and installs new leadership through violence, which means the new leadership has already demonstrated that violence is how power changes hands. A rebellion that fails produces a crackdown. Dissenters are punished. The society reorganizes around fear, and a fear-based society is not stable. It is fragile in a specific way, where the resentment accumulates invisibly until the next cycle begins. Not a solution, a deferral. Even without open rebellion, there is the quieter problem. Running a generation ship requires deep technical expertise. The engineers who maintain life support, the doctors who manage population health, the agronomists who manage the food supply. These people are not interchangeable. Their knowledge is hard to acquire, harder to replace, and essential in a way that is not true of most skills on Earth. Put them in charge and the ship runs well, but technical authority creates a class structure. The people who grow the food and repair the hull and care for the children do all the work the ship needs, and none of the work that confers status. They know it. They feel it. And over time, the resentment that builds between the technically elite and everyone else does not stay contained. The impulse to give people without technical training a real voice in governance is not just a matter of fairness. It is a survival mechanism. People who feel excluded disengage. They do their jobs with less care. They follow protocols loosely. They stop flagging problems they notice, because flagging problems for people who dismiss them is exhausting and eventually pointless. Disengagement is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is a critical system maintained a little less carefully than it was last year, and a little less carefully than that the year before, compounding quietly until something fails. The deeper reveal is this. Governance design seems like a one-time engineering choice. You design the constitution before you launch. You build the institutions, you write the laws. And then the ship flies and the laws govern it. That is the assumption baked into every plan for a generation ship that has ever been seriously proposed. It is not how governance works. Governance is not an object you build and install. It is a process that every generation re-encounters from scratch. The founders understood why the system was designed the way it was. Their children were told why. Their grandchildren were told the story of why. By the 5th or 6th generation, the original logic has become tradition, which is a much weaker thing than logic, because tradition can be challenged, but logic can be explained. A system that cannot explain itself to the people living under it will eventually lose them. Even good systems decay. Power given time concentrates. Officials who start as servants of the system end as its masters. Institutions designed to represent everyone gradually come to represent the people who already have access. This happens on Earth, where external pressure and the availability of alternatives at least slow the process. On a ship with no external pressure and no alternatives, the decay can accelerate without anything to check it. Centuries is a long time. Long enough for a good system to become unrecognizable to the people who designed it, if the people who designed it could somehow see it. Whether any governance structure can remain both stable and adaptive across that span of time is a question no one has answered, because no isolated traveling society has ever existed long enough to find out. And governance is only one of the problems waiting for the generations born aboard. The ship's relationship to the place it left behind, and the place it is trying to reach, raises questions of a different kind entirely. Governance is only one layer of what holds a society together. Beneath it, and in some ways more fundamental, is the question of what people believe. What makes their lives feel worth living? What gives them a reason to endure? On Earth, that question has many answers. People find meaning in work they chose, in families they formed by their own design, in communities they can move between, in personal growth they pursue according to their own appetite. The sources of meaning are varied and replaceable. If one fails, another can expand to fill the space. On the ship, those sources are constrained in ways that compound each other. The work available is what the ship needs, not what any individual person would have chosen freely. Family structure is shaped by demographic policy. The community is fixed at a few thousand people, the same few thousand, with no new faces arriving from outside and no way to leave for somewhere else. Personal growth runs into resource limits at every turn. Books can be copied, skills can be taught. But laboratories require materials, art requires supplies. Ambition requires room to expand, and the ship has very little room. What fills that space historically is belief. Religion has followed human beings into every environment they have occupied, from desert to ice to ocean. It offers something no policy document can provide, the sense that suffering has a purpose, that effort is witnessed, that the people who die in transit without reaching the destination are not simply lost. For a population living and dying aboard a ship that most of them will never see land from, that is not a small offering. It may be the only offering that actually works across generations. But here's where it gets strange. The same quality that makes religious belief so valuable aboard the ship also makes it dangerous. And the danger runs in two opposite directions at once. If the population is religiously diverse, different groups will bring different beliefs into a space with no neutral ground. On Earth, religious communities can separate. They can spread across continents. They can build walls, literal and cultural, between themselves and those they cannot coexist with peacefully. History is full of what happens when they cannot do that. Wars that lasted generations. Persecutions that emptied whole regions of their populations. Violence in the name of what a given group held sacred. All of that human history compresses into a space a few miles long. There is nowhere to retreat. There is no third city to move to. There is no neutral government with an army large enough to enforce peace between factions that genuinely want to destroy each other. The natural response to that recognition is to suggest launching with a religiously unified population. A shared faith could be the binding force. Shared rituals, shared moral frameworks, shared explanations for why the journey is worth the cost. A single belief system might hold the community together across centuries in a way that no governance document alone could manage. Not security, rigidity. A society unified by a single religious framework has purchased cohesion at a price that reveals itself slowly. Dissent becomes heresy, adaptation becomes betrayal. When new information arrives that challenges the doctrine, the society has no mechanism to absorb it gracefully. It can only accept the challenge, which feels like collapse, or reject it, which requires suppression. Intolerant systems are brittle. They hold their shape perfectly until they break. The history of religious authority overriding practical necessity is long and specific. Communities that refused medical treatments on doctrinal grounds. Scientific findings rejected by institutions with the power to silence the scientists. Practical solutions blocked because they conflicted with inherited interpretation. Each of those cases played out on Earth, where alternative institutions existed to eventually correct or route around the blockage. On the ship, there is no routing around. Whatever authority holds, the doctrine holds everything. And the specific conflicts are not abstract. If the population needs genetic engineering to prevent a heritable condition from spreading through a small, closed gene pool, and doctrine forbids it, the ship faces a choice with no clean exits. Accept the engineering and fracture the faith. Refuse it and accept the biological consequence. If religious leaders gain political authority, as they have in nearly every civilization that has ever existed, and that authority overrides the judgment of the engineers keeping the life support running, the margin for error disappears. The people who understand the systems and the people who hold power may not be the same people. And the doctrine versus mission conflict does not only arrive in dramatic confrontations. It arrives in small decisions accumulating across generations. A tradition that made sense in the first century of the voyage that becomes mandatory in the third. A prohibition that was reasonable in one context that applies catastrophically in another. A new prophet arising in the fourth generation, sincere and persuasive, who reinterprets the inherited faith in a direction the ship's designers never anticipated and the ship's systems cannot accommodate. New movements arise, schisms form. Each upheaval threatens the cohesion the mission depends on, not through malice, but through the ordinary process of belief, evolving as it always has. The balance required is as precise as any engineering tolerance the ship demands. People need hope. They need something to believe in that makes the confinement bearable, that gives meaning to lives lived entirely in transit. Without that, the psychological failure modes described earlier arrive faster and harder. But they also need to accept reality as the instruments report it, not as doctrine requires it to be. They need to change their minds when new information demands it. They need to defer to technical expertise when the ship's survival depends on that deference. Holding both of those requirements simultaneously across centuries, while belief naturally evolves and fractures, is not a problem anyone has solved. Whether any belief system can remain both anchoring and flexible enough to coexist with mission requirements across that span of time is still an open question. And the people alive in the third or fourth generation will not be able to go back to the founders for the answer. The beliefs people carry shape every other decision the ship will face, including the most consequential ones of all. The beliefs people carry shape every other decision the ship will face, and none of those decisions will be more intimate or more dangerous than this one. Consider what it means to manage reproduction in a closed system. The ship has a carrying capacity. Food production has a ceiling, water recycling has a ceiling, living space has a ceiling. Those limits are not flexible the way budgets on Earth are flexible. They are physical. And a population that grows past those limits does not experience inconvenience. It experiences starvation, conflict, system failures, and the collapse of the social contract that holds everything together. Too few births carry their own catastrophe. A population that cannot replace its losses shrinks across generations until it falls below the minimum viable threshold, and the mission ends quietly, not with a rebellion but with an empty corridor, and a system running with no one left to tend it. This means reproduction must be controlled. Not loosely shaped by incentive and culture, the way birth rates shift on Earth in response to economics and circumstance. Controlled, deliberately, with mechanisms that decide who is allowed to have a child and when. And this is where the math stops being abstract. The two most commonly proposed systems for managing reproduction aboard a generation ship are a lottery and a merit-based permit. Both have been discussed seriously by researchers who think about long-duration mission design. Both work in a narrow technical sense, and both produce consequences that the word manage does not prepare you for. A lottery is random. A couple enters their names, they wait. When they are selected, they may have a child. This feels fair the way randomness always feels fair, because no authority is judging you. No one is deciding your worth, but a couple desperately wanting children may wait a decade, 2 decades. Some may reach the edge of their reproductive window still waiting, while couples with less interest in parenthood are selected in their first eligible year purely by chance. The lottery produces outcomes no one chose and no one designed, unfair in an impersonal way that offers no one to be angry at, which turns out to have its own psychological cost. A merit-based system addresses that by substituting judgment for chance. Permits go to couples who demonstrate health stability, valuable skills, the kind of genetic diversity the population needs. The ship's population is more protected. The mission's long-term viability is better served. But here's where it gets strange. Someone has to decide what valuable means. Someone has to decide what responsibility looks like. Every criterion they use to make that judgment is a value system. And that value system will reflect who holds authority, not some neutral calculation of mission need. The people excluded from the merit-based system are not told they failed a test. They are told they are not worthy. Those are different messages, and the second one lands differently. People told they are not worthy do not simply accept it, and wait, some do. Some carry the grief quietly, and find other ways to contribute, but some become angry. Some become alienated from a mission that has just told them, in the most intimate possible terms, that they do not fully belong to it. And alienated people in a closed system have one thing available to them that no one wants to think about. They can hurt it. Not loudly necessarily, not with a weapon or a coordinated action. They can simply stop caring, stop maintaining, stop following protocols carefully. The same slow compounding failure mode that disengagement produces in every other domain produces it here too. Except the wound is personal in a way that governance failures and meaning crises are not. This touches the deepest biological layer of what a person is. Unauthorized children make the problem sharper still. A couple that conceives without a permit forces the ship's administration into a choice between terrible options. Punish the parents? The child? The child cannot be punished for a decision it had no part in making. Forced terminations or sterilizations are dark moral territory, imposing them tears a society apart. Refusing to impose them creates an incentive structure that hollows out whichever permit system exists. There is no clean answer here. Every choice has a cost that compounds. There is one more dimension the permit system must account for, and most people do not see it until it is too late. A few thousand people sharing the same living space across several generations face a problem that has nothing to do with carrying capacity. Think of it like paint. If you start with 1,000 colors and mix them together freely, you maintain a rich palette. But if you draw repeatedly from the same small set without adding anything new, the colors converge. Genetic diversity in a small, closed population is not simply a matter of avoiding cousins marrying cousins. Over generations, even careful non-related pairings begin to concentrate certain traits and lose others. The technical term is genetic drift. What it means in practice is that the population grows more similar over time, in ways that make it more vulnerable to diseases and conditions its immune systems have not been built to handle. The proposed solution is to bring frozen embryos or stored genetic material aboard, to be used across generations as a way of introducing new diversity without requiring new passengers. This is medically elegant. It is socially complicated. Children born from frozen Earth material are genetically distinct from the ship-born population in a way that everyone can know, even if no one says it directly. In a community already under the strain of every other pressure this section has described, a group perceived as different, as outsiders imported from a world they never saw, can become the focus of a resentment that has nowhere else to go. The reveal, then, is this. Population control looks like a logistics problem when you first encounter it. Food and water and space have limits. Population must be managed. The numbers have to balance. That framing makes it sound like an engineering equation waiting for an efficient solution. It is not that. It is one of the most destabilizing forces the ship will face. Not because the math is hard. Because the math is applied to the most fundamental human drive there is. The desire to have a child is not a preference. It is not an interest or a hobby or an ambition. It is woven into the biological architecture of the species. Denying or limiting it does not produce mild dissatisfaction, it produces grief. It produces a sense of loss that does not resolve with time. It produces people who feel that the ship has taken something from them that it had no right to take. Some of those people will cope. They will find meaning in other ways, contribute in other directions, and carry the grief without letting it become something worse. But some will not. And the ones who do not will poison the atmosphere around them slowly, the way despair always does, by spreading it to people who had not quite reached it yet. Endemic depression aboard a ship is not simply a mental health crisis, it is a mission failure in progress. And this is only one of the forces bearing down on the people inside. And then there are the children, the ones born into this, shaped by it, inheriting a world someone else built for reasons they did not choose. The question of who they are and how they suffer has been with us since the beginning of this. But there is a harder question underneath it. What must they know, and what happens if they forget? Think about what each new generation would need to understand just to keep the ship alive. Not in general terms. In specifics. Someone must know how to repair the fusion reactor. Someone must know how to recalibrate the water recycling system when it begins to fail. Someone must know the biology of the crops, the chemistry of the atmosphere, the physics of the hull, the mathematics of the navigation. Someone must know medicine, not just how to follow a protocol, but how to reason from first principles when the situation exceeds the protocol. Engineering, agriculture, computer science, biology, physics. The knowledge base required to run a generation ship is not a pamphlet. It is a civilization's worth of technical expertise, compressed into a population of a few thousand people, and it must survive for centuries without losing a single critical thread. The concrete consequence is not abstract. If the generation that understands how to repair the fusion reactor fails to transmit that understanding to the next generation, the ship is fine until the reactor breaks. And then it is not fine. That is what is at stake in every classroom aboard the ship, in every apprenticeship, in every decision about what to teach and how to teach it, and how long to spend teaching it. Not education as a value, education as survival infrastructure. The planners know this, which is why the ship carries redundancy. Multiple people trained in each critical skill, written manuals, video tutorials, interactive training programs, backup systems for the backup systems. But here is where it gets strange. Storing information is not the same as preserving understanding. A digital library does not preserve an intellectual tradition, it preserves text. And text is only as useful as the reader who can interpret it. Consider what happens over 500 years. Languages drift. They drift slowly, invisibly, a word here and a phrase there, each generation inheriting a version slightly different from the one before. After 500 years, the spoken language aboard the ship may have wandered far enough from the language in which the original manuals were written that the manuals are barely intelligible. Not locked away, not destroyed, present intact, stored perfectly in the archive, but practically inaccessible. Like finding an ancient library written in a language you can no longer read. The information is there. The understanding is gone. History has shown us this is not a hypothetical. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single catastrophic fire. It declined over centuries, a piece at a time, until the knowledge it held became inaccessible to the civilization that surrounded it. The Romans knew how to make concrete that has lasted 2,000 years. Not approximately like modern concrete. Structurally superior to it in specific ways we still do not fully understand. That knowledge was lost, not stolen. Not hidden, lost, allowed to drift out of living memory across a handful of generations. It took over 1,000 years to partially recover what the Romans knew. The generation ship has no 1,000 years to spare. It has no neighbouring civilization to borrow knowledge from when its own runs thin. This is why education on the ship cannot be passive. Reading a manual on how to maintain a reactor is not the same as understanding the reactor. Understanding the reactor means being able to reason about it when something breaks in a way the manual did not anticipate. It means apprenticeship. It means working alongside someone who already knows, absorbing not just the procedure, but the judgment behind the procedure. Deep understanding, not procedural memory, the ability to improvise. That kind of transmission requires skilled teachers. and skilled teachers must themselves be trained, evaluated, and renewed. The ship needs a full educational infrastructure, schools, curricula, assessment systems, a pedagogical tradition as well maintained as its mechanical one. Here is the compounding problem. Each generation of teachers trains the next. Any degradation in how well a teacher teaches accumulates across generations. It is like making a copy of a copy of a copy. Each reproduction introduces small errors. Each small error becomes the baseline for the next. After 500 years of this, the quality of education aboard the ship may be a shadow of what it was at launch. Not because anyone chose to let it decay, because decay is the default, maintenance is the exception. And maintaining a pedagogical tradition across centuries, in a closed, isolated system with no external universities to draw from, no journals to read, no conferences to attend, requires effort that must be reinvented in every generation. And then there is the question of what to teach beyond the technical. The ship needs engineers. But it also needs people who are more than engineers: art, philosophy, literature, history. These do not directly maintain the reactor or the water supply, but they maintain something else. They maintain the interior life of a population under conditions of severe constraint. Without beauty, without culture, without something to think about beyond the demands of survival, life aboard the ship becomes purely utilitarian. And purely utilitarian lives are bleak. Bleak people disengage. Disengaged people stop caring for systems. The costs arrive indirectly through the human substrate, not through any single system failure. But there is a tension here that does not resolve cleanly. Technical education and cultural education compete for the same limited hours. A student can spend those hours learning the engineering of the atmospheric system, or reading the poetry of a civilization she will never visit. The ship needs both. But in a genuine resource crunch, technical skills are more immediately necessary than poets. Different ships will make different choices about where to draw that line, and the consequences of those choices will not arrive for generations. The deepest problem is motivation. On Earth, students study because study leads somewhere. Grades become credentials. Credentials become opportunities. Opportunities become lives. The future is genuinely open, and working hard is one of the mechanisms for shaping it. On the ship, the future is not open in the same way. Roles are largely fixed by ship need. The population is small. What the ship requires determines what positions exist. Working harder does not unlock new territories. It mostly confirms you for a role that was going to be yours anyway. Most people need external motivators to sustain hard effort over time, not all of them, but most. And traditional motivators, social mobility, economic incentives, the sense that today's sacrifice is tomorrow's reward, do not translate cleanly into a fixed closed system. New ones must be invented: social recognition, public honors for excellence, increased privileges, better quarters, access to scarce luxuries. The sense that what you do matters to the mission. That you are not just maintaining a system, but carrying something forward on behalf of everyone who will ever live aboard this ship. For some people that is enough, it is genuinely enough, but for others it is not. And when it is not, the result is minimum effort behavior, spread across enough of the population to slowly degrade every system that depends on human attention and care. The harder part is that motivation systems, like everything else aboard the ship, must be actively maintained. They can collapse. The honors that meant something to the first generation become hollow ritual by the fifth. The sense of shared mission that felt vivid at launch fades as the destination recedes into abstraction. New motivators must be invented to replace the ones that stop working. That is its own problem. It requires creativity and social intelligence in every generation. It requires someone to notice when the system is failing before the failure becomes irreversible. The knowledge problem and the motivation problem are not separate. They are the same problem in two registers. What is worth knowing, and why is it worth the effort to know it? On Earth, civilization has been trying to answer those questions for 6,000 years. With all of its institutions and incentive structures and cultural history bearing down on the question. The ship must answer them alone, in isolation across centuries, with no outside course correction available. And the answer it finds in one generation will not automatically hold in the next. It must be found again and again, and again, until the destination is reached, or until it is not, The engineering of the hull can be inspected. Cracks are visible. Failures announce themselves. The erosion of knowledge and motivation does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly, across decades, until the day someone needs to know something that no one aboard the ship knows anymore. That day may be the first sign that it was coming, which means it may already be too late. The erosion is quiet until it is not. Then it announces itself all at once, in the form of something missing. But there is another category of missing that accumulates differently, not knowledge, not motivation, something harder to measure and just as dangerous, the hours. Think about what a day actually contains. A person works, studies, sleeps. That accounts for perhaps 16 of the 24 hours. What fills the rest matters more than it might seem. On Earth, the answer is nearly infinite. You travel. You eat somewhere new. You walk through a city you have never seen. You watch something, read something, hear something that arrived from a part of the world you have never visited. The options are so numerous that boredom requires a kind of effort to sustain. The ship offers none of that. The same corridors, the same rooms, the same faces, the same sounds, the same geometry, every day for the rest of a life. Monotony on that scale does not stay harmless. It breeds restlessness. It breeds dissatisfaction. And dissatisfaction, in a closed environment with no exit and no distraction, tips slowly towards something worse. But here's where it gets strange. The most obvious technological solution to this problem may also be one of its most serious new dangers. Virtual reality, by the time a generation ship is launched, will almost certainly be sophisticated enough to offer convincing alternatives. Simulated forests, beaches, cities the passengers were born too late to see. Voices from a world they will never touch. The promise is real. A person who can walk through a simulated landscape for an hour returns to the real corridor a little lighter. The mind gets novelty, the day gets texture, that matters. But VR cannot deliver everything. It cannot deliver the smell of rain on soil. It cannot deliver the specific weight of wind on skin, or the taste of food grown in an environment that evolved over billions of years. The experience is a copy, and the body knows it. Extended use introduces something that sounds manageable and turns out not to be. Dissociation. The difficulty of distinguishing which experiences were real and which were constructed. And over time, something subtler and more dangerous. The preference for the virtual over the actual. Not a curiosity. A threat. If people retreat far enough into simulated environments, the real world aboard the ship begins to feel thin and unsatisfying. Real conversations feel pale beside constructed ones. Real relationships feel difficult beside scripted ease. And real-world cooperation, the kind that keeps the reactor running, and the crops alive, and the air breathable, requires people to be present and invested in actual life with actual others. A population that has partially retreated does not cooperate the same way. The mission depends on people who are here, not on people who have found a more comfortable somewhere else. Virtual reality must function as a supplement, not a replacement. The line between those two things will be one of the hardest lines to hold. Sports offer something different. Physical exertion, direct competition. The kind of social bonding that happens when bodies are in the same space, working toward the same goal at the same time. The ship can support adapted versions. Low-gravity variants in sections where rotation is reduced. Scaled-down versions of traditional games in spaces small enough to fit inside the hull. They give exercise. They give teams. They give seasons and scores, and the temporary importance of something that does not determine whether anyone survives. That last part is not trivial. On a ship where almost everything carries life or death weight, something that is serious but not critical is a psychological relief. The limitation is space. There are no full-size fields, no large arenas, no room for a game that requires a kilometer of open ground. Whatever sports exist aboard the ship will be small, improvised, adapted, that still leaves them worth having. Art and music carry a different kind of weight. A painting cannot keep the reactor running. A song cannot scrub carbon dioxide from the air, but they process things that nothing else processes: grief, fear, the specific loneliness of living inside a machine that will not stop moving. Music builds community in a way that shared danger alone cannot. A concert, a communal song, a performance that the whole population attends together, gives people a shared experience that is not about survival. Those experiences accumulate into a culture. A culture is not separate from a mission. It is the substrate that holds the mission together. But here is the problem. Every instrument takes cargo space. Every kilogram of art materials is a kilogram of something else that did not make it aboard. Every rehearsal space is a room that could store spare parts. The ship must carry both, but in what proportion, nobody knows in advance. The generation that launches will decide. The generation that inherits the decision will live inside it, and some of them will disagree, loudly. This is the trade-off that runs beneath everything. Survival without quality of life is just existence. You breathe, you work, you maintain, you die. Nothing was built, nothing was made that mattered beyond the minimum. Quality of life without survival is nothing at all. Both are required. Neither can be fully optimized without costing the other. The balance is not a problem to be solved once and recorded in the ship's charter. It is a negotiation that must happen in every generation, between people with different values and different needs, and different ideas about what the mission is actually for. And knowing that the negotiation will never be final compounds, something that was already difficult. You are part of a journey you will never see completed. You were born into it. You did not choose it. The destination is not for you. It's for people who will not exist until after you are gone. Some people find a kind of dignity in that, being essential, being the link that cannot be removed from the chain, taking pride in the work precisely because the work is larger than a single life. That is a coherent response. It is not the only one. Others will resist, not as a quiet philosophical objection, but as something louder. Born into a mission they never endorsed, with no way to leave, no way to vote the mission out of existence, and decades ahead of more of the same. Some will advocate turning back, even if turning back is no longer viable. Some will argue for stopping somewhere shorter, an asteroid, a rogue planet caught by no sun, anywhere but the destination that was chosen for them before they existed. Some will simply stop caring about the destination at all, and insist that the ship has already become the home, and the mission as originally defined is a relic of people who are dead. The original crew made a choice, their descendants did not. That asymmetry does not resolve. Cultural practices, rituals, celebrations, stories told across generations can reinforce the meaning of the mission. They can remind people of what they are part of. They can make the dead feel present and the destination feel real, but they cannot force agreement. Some people will always resist. And on a ship with no exit, resistance has nowhere to go. It does not leave. It does not find another city and start over. It stays, and it presses, and it accumulates, just like everything else aboard the ship that has no release valve. How that pressure is managed across generations by a population that did not choose its circumstances is one of the questions that will determine whether the mission survives its own people. And it will not be the last. And it will not be the last, because the pressure building inside a closed community does not stay abstract. At some point something breaks. Not metaphorically, physically, biologically, or socially. And when it does, there is no one to call. Consider what failure actually looks like on a generation ship. Not failure as a slow erosion, the kind described in governance chapters and meaning crises and reproductive disputes. Failure as an event, sudden, specific, and irreversible. The most obvious version is a hull breach. A micrometeorite, a structural fatigue point, a welding seam that held for 200 years and then did not. The atmosphere begins venting. Bulkheads seal automatically, containing the breach, preserving the rest of the ship. The engineering works exactly as designed. And the people trapped on the wrong side of those bulkheads are gone within minutes. On a ship of roughly 1,000 people, 50 dead is 5% of the population. That sounds like a survivable loss. It is not. Not for a closed system. 5% of the total gene pool narrowed permanently with no way to replace what was lost. 5% of the trained workforce, including possibly the only person who fully understood one of the critical repair systems. Entire families gone, children without parents, parents without children, roles with no successors. The grief would be enormous, and it would not stay grief, it would become demands for answers, for accountability, for reassurance that it cannot happen again. And some people, standing over that loss, would say the only reasonable response is to abort the mission. But there is nowhere to abort to. At the halfway point of a 400-year crossing, turning back takes as long as pressing forward. The commitment made before departure is now structural. The ship does not have that exit. The people demanding it do not have it either. And the leadership must govern through that grief, through that anger, with no release valve and no rescue. The biological failure mode is quieter at first. A dormant pathogen waking in the ship's environment, or a common microorganism mutating over generations of closed system evolution into something the population has no defense against. Disease spreads fast in confined spaces. Every infectious disease model built for closed populations shows rapid transmission when exposure is constant, and there is no outside reservoir to dilute infection rates. Medical facilities aboard the ship are basic. There is no pharmaceutical manufacturing infrastructure capable of producing novel treatments. What was brought from Earth is what exists, and what can be synthesized from onboard chemistry is limited. An untreatable disease does not stay contained by medicine. It spreads, and more importantly, it spreads panic faster than it spreads itself. But here's where it gets strange. The disease does not even need to kill most of the population to end the mission. It only needs to kill the wrong people. The engineer who maintains the water recycler, the doctor who manages radiation sickness for the crew working near the reactor shielding, the teacher who trained the next cohort of atmospheric chemists. Knowledge dies with those people. Systems begin failing not from the disease, but from the absence of the people who kept them running. One failure creates the conditions for the next. The death spiral is not about mortality counts. It is about the irreplaceable nature of specific human competencies in a system with no backup labor pool to draw from. Social breakdown does not require a catastrophic event. It can begin with a dispute over quarters, over rationing decisions, over an old grievance between two families that calcified into something structural across generations. But once violence enters the ship's closed environment, it becomes uniquely dangerous in ways that violence on Earth does not. There is nowhere to put distance between hostile groups. No other city to relocate to, no border to cross, no region to retreat into. Everyone remains in physical proximity to everyone else. Fighting in a confined metal environment can damage critical systems. Fire in a closed environment with limited oxygen reserves is a different kind of catastrophe than fire in open air. Even improvised weapons become terrifying when the walls around you are also the walls keeping you alive. The historical anchors are worth holding here. The Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the winter of 1846, did not begin as a group of people prone to extreme behavior. They were ordinary people placed under conditions they had not anticipated and could not escape. Within months, they were consuming the dead to survive. The Pitcairn Island mutineers, who settled their remote island in 1790 after the Bounty Mutiny, had everything they needed to build a stable small community. Within a few years, they had descended into murder. The settlement was effectively a war zone before it stabilized, and only barely. Both groups were isolated. Both were under resource pressure. Both had no external authority to appeal to, and no exit available. The generation ship replicates every one of those conditions, across centuries rather than months or years. And violence, once it has established itself as a mechanism, does not stay in the generation that invented it. Feuds are inherited. Children are taught, not always explicitly, who the enemies are. The enmity passes to people who never experienced the original grievance, but now carry it as part of their identity. Resources that should maintain the reactor get diverted to conflict. Systems degrade while people are focused on survival of the social, rather than survival of the ship. Conflict resolution mechanisms have to exist and have to work. Anti-violence norms have to hold across centuries. A trusted justice system has to function without the external backing that every functioning justice system on Earth relies on. Building and maintaining those structures is difficult. Maintaining them for 200 years, as the culture aboard drifts further from its origins, is extraordinarily difficult. Maintaining them for 400 or 500 years, as Earth recedes from living memory into something closer to myth, is a problem no existing human institution has solved. And that drift is itself one of the failure modes. By approximately 200 years into the crossing, the people aboard have no direct connection to Earth. No one who touched Earth soil is still alive. Earth is a place known only from descriptions and archived footage, and stories told by people who heard stories from people who heard stories. It becomes in practical terms as alien as any distant planet. The emotional weight of reaching the destination fades with each generation that did not choose the journey. Mission commitment was not their decision. The decision was made by people who are dead, and at some point, a generation may look at the decades remaining and conclude that the sacrifice is not theirs to make. That stopping is reasonable, that the ship as it is already the home. The founding logic that powered the original departure has now passed through enough retellings to become something closer to legend, and legends do not carry the same authority as lived decisions. What that means, taken together across the hull breach, and the disease spiral, and the social breakdown, and the cultural drift, is this. The margin for catastrophe on a generation ship is not a percentage calculated against a large background population. 1,000 people is the entire population. 50 dead is 5% of everything. Not 5% of a city that recovers and rebuilds. 5% of the genetic pool, the skilled workforce, the social memory. There is no broader humanity absorbing the loss. There is only what remains on the ship. Every catastrophic scenario carries that arithmetic, and the people who will have to live through it are the same people carrying all the other pressures already described. The pressure cooker does not run at one temperature, it runs at all of them simultaneously. There is no section of this problem that stands alone. Each failure mode makes the others worse. Grief from a hull breach erodes trust in leadership. Eroded leadership struggles to manage a disease outbreak. A disease outbreak that kills technical experts accelerates knowledge loss. Knowledge loss leads to system failures that increase conflict over shrinking resources. Social breakdown makes the cultural drift problem more acute. Cultural drift makes mission commitment more fragile. And fragile mission commitment makes every other failure harder to recover from, because the will to recover depends on believing the mission is still worth it. That question whether it remains worth it will not be answered once. It will have to be answered again by every generation that inherits it. And some of those generations will answer differently. And for the ones who answer yes, who hold the mission together through every pressure described, through every grief and failure and fracture, a moment eventually arrives that should feel like vindication. Let's say it does. 500 years into the crossing, or 1,000 or 1,500, the destination star system comes into view. Telescopes resolve the shapes of planets around a foreign sun. And there, at the right distance from that star, in the zone where liquid water is possible, one world catches every measurement they run. Right size, right temperature range, spectroscopy showing oxygen in the atmosphere. The people on the ship have trained their whole lives for this, and their parents trained for it, and their parents before them. The instruments confirm what the mission was built to find. But here's where it gets strange. The people looking through those instruments are not the people who left Earth, not even distantly. The men and women who loaded supplies and said goodbye to their families and felt the weight of departure as a personal embodied grief have been dead for centuries. What remains is their descendants, born and raised in corridors and crop bays and rotating habitat rings, shaped entirely by a life their ancestors could only imagine. Their bones are calibrated to the ship's gravity. Their immune systems have never been tested by the full complexity of an open biosphere. Their psychology is organized around closed, controlled, bounded space. They have known one world their entire lives. It is the world that is about to change completely. A real planet means real gravity, heavier and more constant than anything the ship could simulate. It means weather, wind, temperature swings that come from atmospheric systems too large to predict, not from a thermostat. It means a living ecosystem with microorganisms in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in the skin of every native creature. And the arriving population's immune systems have no experience with any of it. Not reduced experience, none. The adjustment will be hard. Some colonists, particularly those older or already weakened by decades of ship life, may not be able to descend to the surface at all. The gravity alone could be dangerous. For those who do make landfall, what follows is a brutal selection process. Their bodies will encounter microorganism after microorganism that evolution on another world produced. Organisms their immune systems have no framework to recognize. Some colonists will adapt. Some will develop chronic illness. Some will be lost to infections their shipboard medicine never prepared for and never anticipated. Settling a planet is stepping into wilderness. The rules of that wilderness are unknown, possible predators, competing species, pathogens that spread through contact with soil or water before anyone thinks to test for them. The ship brought weapons and tools, but no library of this planet's dangers. The cost of learning those rules is paid in people, and not everyone will want to pay it. The ship, for all its constraints and losses and pressures, is home to everyone still alive. The planet is alien. Some people will refuse to leave. They will choose the known corridors over the unknown surface, the familiar air over the untested atmosphere. This split has a name even before it happens. The planet-siders, the ones who descend. The ship-siders, the ones who stay. Both groups will have reasons that feel entirely reasonable to the people holding them. But the ship was not designed for indefinite occupation. It was designed to carry people somewhere and deliver them. Its systems are degrading. Every component that has been running for centuries is closer to failure than it was on departure day. The ship cannot sustain a permanent population indefinitely. At some point, it becomes uninhabitable. Convincing people to leave before that point, to step out into a world that has already claimed some of their friends, is not a command that governance can simply issue. It is a negotiation, and the negotiation will happen against a backdrop of resource conflicts, because the ship carries stockpiles that both groups need, and neither group is willing to defer entirely to the other. The colony can fracture here, on the edge of everything the mission was for. There is another question beneath that fracture: whether the planet is actually what the data suggested. Spectroscopy showing oxygen does not mean the atmosphere is comfortable to breathe. It might carry allergens in concentrations that cause permanent lung damage. It might carry trace compounds that are harmless for a week and toxic over a decade. The climate might be more extreme than remote measurement could reveal, with seasons violent enough to collapse surface structures that were built for modeled averages. The planet might be broadly hospitable and still require decades or centuries of work before the colony is truly stable, or the planet might not be alone in the biological sense. If the ecosystem is complex enough, native life will range from microorganisms to larger forms, possibly predators, possibly something more. And after centuries of travel, after generations of sacrifice, the colonists will face a question no one could answer from Earth. What right do they have to displace what was already here? To contaminate a biosphere that evolved without them? The ethical weight of that question is real, and the practical weight is that no one will want to hear it. The alternative is another journey of equal length. No one will want that either, so the colonists will stay. They will push through the selection pressure and the conflict and the uncertainty. Most will. The colony will take hold, and then slowly something else happens. Children are born on solid ground. They grow up under an open sky, with wind and weather and gravity that is simply normal, because it is the only gravity they have ever known. To them, the ship is the alien thing. They have heard stories of it, the way their ancestors heard stories of Earth, as something real but not felt. One world is traded for another, generation by generation, and the memory of origin drifts further with each one. Eventually, the ship is abandoned, stripped of anything useful. Left in orbit, empty, a piece of machinery that served its purpose and became a relic. The civilization that grows from that colony is shaped by the planet that received it, by the specific pressure of its gravity, the chemistry of its soil, the rhythms of its seasons, the threats and resources its ecosystem offers. Genetically, culturally, psychologically, the people who emerge across centuries are not the people who departed Earth. They are something new, a new branch. They will remember Earth the way you remember a story someone told you long ago about a place you have never been. Not as home, as a point of origin. That is the destination the mission was always aiming for, not a place, a becoming. And is both the most extraordinary thing a civilization has ever attempted and a reminder of what it cost. Generations born and lived and gone in transit, for an outcome none of them would see. The first people to stand on that surface under that foreign sun will carry that weight with them, even if they do not know exactly how to name it. Whether they look back at the sky and recognize it, the journey that made them will still be there, written into everything they are. That weight does not lift when the journey is over. It was there from the beginning. And to understand what the arrival cost, you have to go back to the long middle of it. Back to the centuries of crossing, back to the slow kinds of damage that do not announce themselves. The ones that accumulate quietly across generations with no single moment of failure to point to. At launch, everything is new. Every system, every component, every seal and bearing and circuit runs at its design specification. The redundancies are in place. The spare parts are stocked. The ship is as ready as it will ever be. It does not stay that way. Metal fatigues under constant stress. Radiation degrades materials from the inside out. Electronics fail. Seals crack. Bearings wear down. Every mechanical system has a finite operational lifespan, and the ship carries thousands of them. On Earth, a worn component is replaced with one sourced from a factory somewhere. On a generation ship crossing interstellar space, there are no factories, there is no supply chain, there is no resupply. Every replacement must come from what is already aboard. That means recycling, breaking a failed component down to its raw materials and reforming them into something new. In principle, this works. In practice, recycling is not a lossless process. Each cycle introduces small impurities. Each cycle degrades the structural properties of the base material slightly. The recycled many times metal is not the same as the original. It is weaker, more brittle, more prone to fatigue. By the 500-year mark, that degradation compounds. The ship is not the vessel that launched. It is a vessel held together with centuries of repairs, each repair slightly inferior to the one before. Not catastrophically, not obviously, but the margins shrink, one unexpected stress. One load the weakened material cannot absorb, and what was barely functional becomes suddenly not functional at all. But here's where it gets strange. The material problem, severe as it is not the deepest form of erosion. There is another kind of decay, one that operates in the same, slow, invisible way. And it happens not in the metal, but in the people. The original crew understood the systems they maintained. They were trained by the civilization that designed them. They knew not just the procedures, but the reasoning behind the procedures. If something unexpected happened, they could think through it from first principles. They could adapt. Their children learned from them. Good training, thorough training, but one step removed from the source. By the 10th generation, something has changed. The maintainers know the procedures. They know that if a certain pressure drops below a certain threshold, a certain valve must be adjusted in a certain sequence. They know the steps. What they may no longer know is why those steps produce that outcome. They cannot derive it. They cannot reason backward from the symptom to the cause. They follow the manual, and as long as the manual covers the situation, everything is fine. When a situation the manual does not cover arrives, they are lost. This is the deeper danger. The ship may be running normally, all systems nominal, no obvious crisis. But the people running it have become caretakers rather than engineers. They maintain what works. They cannot diagnose what fails in an unprecedented way. They cannot innovate. The knowledge is present, recorded in libraries, stored in archives. But stored information is not the same as living understanding. Understanding requires education, practice, mentorship, an intellectual tradition passing from one mind to the next. The archive is there, the understanding is gone. It is like inheriting a workshop full of tools from a craftsman who never taught you the trade. And while this is happening inside the ship, something else is happening to the ship's relationship with the civilization that built it. In the first decades, communication with Earth is difficult but possible. Messages travel for years and arrive years later. Earth sends news, updates, encouragement. The ship sends status reports. A connection exists, it is slow and one-sided, but it is there. At 10 light-years from Earth, a one-way message takes 10 years to arrive. A question asked from the ship reaches Earth a decade later. The answer takes another decade to return. A round-trip conversation spans 20 years. At 100 light-years, a round-trip message takes 2 centuries. Anyone who sends a message will be dead before any reply arrives. The person who receives the reply never knew the person who sent the original question. Communication has stopped being dialogue. It has become something closer to leaving letters for strangers you will never meet, addressed to strangers who do not yet exist. Eventually it stops entirely. Either Earth stops sending, or the ship stops listening, or the distance becomes so vast that the signal cannot be reliably received. The link severs. And when it does, the few thousand people aboard the ship are, as far as anyone aboard can know, the entire human race. Not a branch of it, not a remote outpost of it, the whole of it. Everyone they will ever speak to, ever see, ever grieve with or argue with or love is contained within a few miles of Hull. Earth is still there, but it is for all practical purposes unreachable. The ship has become its own sealed universe. That has weight. Humans are social creatures, shaped by belonging to something larger than themselves. The severing of that connection does not leave a vacuum. It leaves a kind of pressure, an existential compression that has no release. Some people will find ways to carry it, others will not. The interstellar medium adds its own hazards to this. Interstellar space is not empty. Rogue planets drift through it, ejected long ago from their home systems. They do not emit light. They are nearly invisible. At sufficient velocity, a sensor failure or an object moving faster than expected means a collision that ends the mission instantly. Not with warning, without it. Dense gas and dust clouds present a different threat. Most interstellar clouds are thin enough to cross without serious damage. Some are denser. Enter a dense cloud at high velocity, and the ship is moving through something that behaves like a storm of particles, each impact releasing energy against the hull. Individually manageable, cumulatively devastating, and gas clouds are vast, spanning light years. By the time the instruments detect one, the ship may already be inside it. The only option may be to decelerate, which adds years to the crossing. More years means more generations in transit, more strain on resources, more strain on cohesion, more of everything the mission is already carrying. Then there are the emergencies that cannot be avoided at all. Picture a critical system failing in the deep middle of interstellar space, a fusion reactor going offline, life support switching to emergency power, days or weeks of oxygen remaining. The repair team gathers in near-freezing conditions, because heat is being rationed along with everything else. They are working on systems centuries old, with parts that are not original, using tools that have been remade from recycled material. They are exhausted. They are aware at every moment of what failure means. Not a setback, not a delay. The ship becomes a tomb. A lifeless hulk drifting forever through interstellar space, carrying everything that was entrusted to it, reaching nothing. If the repair succeeds, the mission continues. If it fails, it does not. Redundancy exists to prevent this. Multiple reactors, multiple life support units, each system with a backup, but redundancy has a cost, mass. And mass requires energy to move. Engineers at the design stage must decide how much redundancy is enough. Too little and a single failure is catastrophic. Too much and the ship cannot reach the speeds it needs. There is no perfect answer. There is only the best available balance, chosen before launch, by people who will never have to live with the consequences themselves. And while the ship is managing all of this, Earth is not standing still. The ship launches with the best technology available at its moment of departure. Earth keeps advancing. Halfway to the destination, Earth may have developed propulsion systems that render the ship's design obsolete. Life support systems that are more efficient. Medical technology that could address the specific health challenges the colonists are facing. The ship cannot access any of it. It is locked to the technology it launched with, watching through delayed signals as the civilization it left behind moves further and further ahead. The people aboard know this. They receive messages, for as long as messages still arrive, telling them about advances they cannot use, equipment they will never have, treatments that might have helped someone who died years ago. They are not only isolated in space, they are isolated in time. The mission they are serving was designed by a civilization that no longer exists in quite the same form, and every year of travel makes that gap wider. That is not an engineering problem, it is something harder. The quiet recognition that you are behind, and that you cannot catch up, and that the gap will only grow. None of these threats announce themselves. No single moment turns the ship from a functioning vessel into a failing one. The material degrades slowly, the knowledge erodes slowly, the communication thins and then stops. The obsolescence widens year by year, Each pressure on its own might be manageable. Together, compounding over decades and centuries, they add weight the mission was never fully designed to carry. And the journey ahead is still not finished. The journey ahead is still not finished. And the threats still coming are not the ones that announce themselves with a breach alarm or a failing reactor. They are slower than that, slower than any individual life can perceive. They operate at the level of genes, of language, of the quiet arithmetic of birth and death, across generation after generation. The human body carries an instruction set written in DNA, and that instruction set is not fixed, it changes. Mutations occur constantly in every organism, in every generation. In a large population spread across a planet, most harmful mutations dilute. There are enough variations, enough different genetic backgrounds, that no single bad instruction can dominate. But in a small, isolated population, the math runs differently. Harmful mutations spread more easily. There is less variation to dilute them, less genetic distance between potential partners. The technical is inbreeding depression, and the consequences are not theoretical. Island species show the signs after enough generations of isolation. Several European royal families, who practiced close cousin marriage across centuries to consolidate political power, showed elevated rates of genetic disorder, shorter lifespans, and declining fertility. Not as punishment, not as coincidence, as mathematics. A small closed gene pool concentrates whatever it carries, the good and the bad together, and the bad is easier to notice. A generation ship is by definition a small closed gene pool. The ship can carry stored genetic material, frozen embryos, catalogued diversity brought from Earth for exactly this reason. Active genetic management, meaning embryo screening, deliberate selection for diversity, possibly direct genetic engineering, would be required to keep the population's biological heritage healthy across centuries. But here's where it gets strange. Those are also the practices most likely to face ethical and religious resistance. Factions that believe genetic intervention is morally wrong, that the natural course of inheritance should not be manipulated, could block the very tools needed to keep the population biologically viable. If those factions gain political authority, if they make the practices illegal aboard the ship, then the ship loses the ability to manage what the mathematics of isolation is doing to its own gene pool. Slowly, across generations, the health indicators shift. More difficult births, higher infant mortality, shorter lifespans. The population does not collapse immediately, it declines quietly. Across 100 years, 200 years. By the time it is visible as a crisis, the solutions that could have prevented it have been forbidden for so long that fighting to restore them is its own political crisis. The radiation compounds this. Even with the best shielding the ship can carry, some gets through. Cosmic rays are not stopped by metal and water the way common particles are. They carry enough energy to pass through materials that block almost everything else. The dose any individual receives over a lifetime is not immediately lethal, but it is cumulative. Each year of deep space transit adds another increment of DNA damage. Some of that damage affects the individual. Some of it, carried in reproductive cells, passes to the next generation. Across centuries, the cumulative genetic damage to a population that has lived through hundreds of years of elevated radiation exposure could be significant. More cancer, more birth defects, more neurological difficulty, and there is no escape from it. You cannot reduce your exposure below what the shielding provides. You cannot leave the ship. You endure it year after year, and you watch your children endure it, knowing the exposure does not decline, knowing it accumulates. The psychological weight of that is its own burden stacked on top of the physical one. Then there is language. Language drifts on its own, even in populations that are not isolated. English spoken 500 years ago is difficult to read today without training. Words drop out of use. New words fill the gaps they leave, meanings shift, grammar evolves. In an isolated ship population with no stabilizing contact with the outside world, that drift accelerates. After 500 years, the language aboard may not be fully intelligible to people speaking the Earth original. And language carries culture, the stories people tell, the values embedded in which things have words and which things do not, the traditions that get passed down, changed in the passing, changed again, reshaped by experiences that the founding generation never had and could not have anticipated. Ship life creates its own experiences, specific to that environment, specific to the generations who lived in it, entirely unlike anything Earth culture prepared for. After 500 years, the people aboard the ship do not think of themselves as humans from Earth, completing a mission their ancestors designed. They think of themselves as ship people, a distinct identity, with their own history, their own stories, their own sense of what matters and why. And that identity may not include loyalty to a destination that was chosen before anyone living was born. This is the philosophical question the mission cannot escape. If the descendants no longer identify with the original purpose, do they still have an obligation to complete it? The founding generation chose to go. They knew what they were committing to, but the 5th generation did not choose. The 10th generation did not choose. The 15th generation did not choose. They were born into a trajectory set by people they know only through archived records. People who are to them as remote as any historical figure. Do the decisions of ancestors bind their descendants indefinitely? There is no clean answer. From one perspective, the mission is a commitment that must be honored, a promise made on behalf of all who would follow. From another perspective, the descendants are living people with their own agency, and being permanently bound by the choices of the long dead is a form of imprisonment, not duty. Both of these are coherent positions. A generation that lands at the destination would represent everything the mission was built for. A generation that decides to stop, or to settle somewhere short of the original target, or to simply let the ship drift and call it home, would be exercising a kind of self-determination that is hard to condemn entirely. The mission designers had no mechanism to prevent this, because no mechanism could hold across the lifetimes of people who were never asked. And then there is the arithmetic. Every generation must hit a narrow target. Births must match or exceed deaths, but cannot so greatly exceed them that the population outgrows the ship's capacity. Too few births over a century and the population shrinks, losing genetic diversity, losing skilled workers, losing the minimum viable size the mission requires. Too many births over a century, and the ship strains, food production falls short, resource conflict rises, quality of life degrades, and that degradation produces the conditions for exactly the kind of social breakdown that earlier sections of this journey described. The target band is not wide, and it must be hit not once, but every generation, indefinitely, without fail. A small deviation sustained over 200 years can halve a population, not through catastrophe, not through plague or breach, through the quiet compounding of a slightly lower birth rate, year after year, until the number of people alive is no longer sufficient to sustain the knowledge, the labor, and the genetic diversity the mission needs. One generation that loses hold of the demographic balance can set a trajectory that cannot be corrected in time. The correction takes generations, and in a closed system with no outside assistance, there is no reserve to draw from while you wait. Wait. These are the threats that kill missions in the imagination slowly, but kill them just as certainly as any hull breach or plague. The dramatic failures are visible. They have a moment. They have an alarm. The slow failures have neither. Bad genes accumulate without a warning light. Radiation damage adds its increment silently, year after year. Language shifts without anyone noticing the shift. Cultural identity drifts without a vote or a declaration. Birth rates slip by a fraction, and then another fraction, and the population that was viable last century is not viable this one. No single moment of failure, no single decision that ends the mission. Just the weight of time pressing on everything at once, and the question of whether the people alive in that moment still believe the destination is worth reaching. They may, or they may not, and the mission, if it survives everything else, still has to survive that. And the mission, if it survives everything else, still has to survive that. But before any of those internal pressures arrive, before the first generation born aboard wonders what their life means, the mission has to clear a different kind of obstacle. Not the physics of propulsion, not the biology of closed ecosystems, something harder, human institutions, human time horizons, human disagreement about who deserves a seat. Building a generation ship would cost trillions of dollars, possibly tens of trillions. That is more than the entire annual economic output of most countries on Earth, not the military budget, not the space budget, the entire economy, and whoever funds it would receive nothing in return for centuries. No votes won, no economic dividend, no political legacy that any living person would see completed. Humans are not naturally good at that kind of investment. Politicians are worse. The incentive structure points entirely the wrong way. The mission gets serious political traction under one condition: crisis. When Earth itself becomes the danger, when climate change spirals past any correction, when an asteroid is confirmed incoming, when some other extinction-level pressure makes staying the worse option, then the calculus changes. Then a generation ship becomes a backup plan rather than an aspiration. And perhaps that is the only realistic path to actually building one. But here's where it gets strange. Building a generation ship takes decades, possibly longer. The crisis that creates the political will to start construction may resolve, or deepen beyond recovery, or transform into something else entirely, long before the ship is ready to launch. The urgency that unlocks the funding does not hold still and wait for the engineering to finish. Timing a crisis and a construction timeline is not something any committee can control. The window may open and close before the ship exists, and even if funding is secured, there is another problem. One that may generate more conflict than the engineering ever does. Who gets to go? 1,000 seats. Billions of candidates. The selection method alone could fracture the coalition that built the ship in the first place. A lottery treats everyone as equally deserving, and produces outcomes that feel arbitrary and cruel. A merit-based system requires someone to judge whose skills and health and psychological profile justify a seat, which means someone decides whose life is worth the investment and whose is not. A wealth-based system simply sells survival to the highest bidder. Political connections produce their own obvious corruption. Every method is defensible on some axis. None is defensible on all of them. The people who don't get a seat know it. They watch the selection unfold. Some accept it, others do not. And a mission that cannot launch because the excluded have delayed it or damaged it or dismantled its political support is a mission that fails before it begins. The social and political challenge of launching a generation ship may be harder than building it. Not a supporting obstacle, the central one. Hold that in mind, because now the ship is launched somehow. Against every political and economic and institutional gravity, it has cleared the solar system and is moving toward a star. And we need to hold a different view at the same time. Not the view from Earth, watching the ship go. The view from inside, from a single life in the middle of the crossing. Imagine being born 30 years into the journey. Your parents boarded voluntarily. They made a choice, weighed it against everything they knew and stepped aboard. You made no such choice. You arrived into a world that had already been decided for you, in a ship that was already underway, heading toward a destination you will never reach. Earth exists for you the way a story exists. You know it is real. You have seen the archived footage, the photographs, the recorded testimony of people who walked outside and felt wind on their face. Intellectually, you understand that forests exist, that oceans exist, that open sky exists. Emotionally, it is a myth. The ship is not a vessel you are passing through. It is the only world you have ever known and will ever know. The metal corridors, the hydroponic bays, the hum of life support cycling, the faces of the same few hundred people. That is the entirety of existence. You will live here for 70 or 80 years, do whatever work the ship requires, have whatever relationships this community allows, and then you will be gone. Your children will continue, possibly their children, and their children's children, for centuries after you. The meaning problem is not abstract. It is something you wake up with every morning. How do you build a life that feels worth living when your entire existence is a small increment in a journey too long for any one person to witness? Some people find the answer in contribution, in being the link that cannot be removed, the generation that kept the mission alive when it might have failed. That is a real answer. It sustains people, but it does not sustain everyone. Others feel it differently. They feel the weight of a choice made before they existed, pressing on every day of their lives, with no way to step outside it. No exit. Billions of miles from the nearest other world where resentment and depression are not personal failures. They are structural outcomes. Mental health is not a comfort issue aboard a generation ship. It is an engineering constraint. If 10% of a 1,000-person population is in severe depression at any given time, that is 100 people not fully contributing to the work the ship requires. 100 people who need care rather than providing it, across every generation. That burden is ongoing, and it compounds, because depression spreads in close quarters, because hopelessness is contagious in confined environments, because the people providing the care are living inside the same pressures as the people receiving it, and every decision made aboard is made on incomplete information. The light-speed communication delay means that any message from Earth takes years to arrive. A question asked today receives an answer years from now, in response to conditions that no longer exist. Should the ship alter course, speed up, change destinations based on new telescope data from Earth? Every choice is made on years-old information, sometimes decades old. The ship is not flying blind in the way an explorer without a map is blind. It is flying blind in a stranger way. It has information, but the information is always from the past, and the past keeps receding further. And Earth keeps advancing. New discoveries, new technologies, new understanding of the destination. The people aboard hear about it eventually through messages with long delays. They learn that methods developed after their launch could have solved problems they have been struggling with for decades. Equipment they will never have, treatments for people already dead. But the worst version of technological advance is not obsolescence. It is being overtaken. Suppose Earth develops a breakthrough propulsion system 40 years after the generation ship launches. Not a marginal improvement, a fundamental one. A ship that can cross in a fraction of the time. Earth builds it, launches it. That ship overtakes the generation ship while it is still in transit. Arrives at the destination first. Establishes a colony, builds infrastructure over decades. And then the generation ship arrives. Not as pioneers, as relics. The sacrifice of dozens of generations rendered not heroic but redundant. The people who gave their entire lives to the crossing step out of an ancient vessel, into a world that already has buildings and roads, and people who arrived faster and built more in less time. That is a speculative scenario, but it is rooted in something real. Technology does not stop advancing because a ship has already launched. The crossing takes centuries. Centuries is enough time for everything to change. Or Earth does not overtake the ship. It simply forgets it. The launch is a historic moment. Celebrations, broadcasts, a sense of humanity reaching across the dark, and then time passes, decades. New crises emerge on Earth, new political priorities, new catastrophes that demand all available attention. The generation ship becomes a footnote in the way that early expeditions become footnotes. The messages grow less frequent, the replies grow shorter, eventually silence. The people aboard arrive expecting acknowledgement, recognition, some sign that Earth remembers what their ancestors sacrificed. And there is nothing, no follow-up mission, no welcoming signal. Earth has moved on, into whatever the next century's brought,